I began to think like, okay, how can I make that better? And so I think this like problem solving mindset started to develop very early on. And then I think the other sort of application of that too was little inklings of entrepreneurship as well, where I was really into finding new ways of making a little bit of money, having fun with it too.
Welcome to Marketing by Design, where you and I learned from our favorite founders and marketers on how they built their success and told their stories by design. I am your host, Andy Milligan. Let's get started. What's happening, people? Welcome back to another powerful episode of Marketing by Design. As marketers, as creatives, a lot of us are a little bit tense in terms of where the future is headed with AI, all the new tools that are coming out, and what that means for our role as maybe if you're in-house, you're a more traditional graphic designer, maybe you work a little bit in UI, UX. But the biggest thing that's changing is where the value is headed. Josh Canale, who's the guy we're talking to today, has built a pretty revolutionary business model. And you guys will learn more about him in the episode. But essentially, he started in-house. He started working with the team, building design systems, and coming more from the traditional creative front, as I did, and then transitioned to go out on his own. Now, I did so because of a layoff. Josh did so on his own means, but I connected with Josh through some of his LinkedIn content, and I was just blown away by the stuff the guy was putting out. And to be honest with you, I view him as someone who is kind of holding the torch and viewing his way through the changes in design with the AI era and trying all these new tools, sharing what he's learning, and honestly, and this conversation taught me a lot about where the value is headed for designers in the future. A little bit about Josh before we dive in. Josh is the founder of Float, which is a design and UX consultancy, and it's a pretty revolutionary business concept. He's managed to shrink the time to value, and his main value prop is getting an MVP ready build, whether it's a product or mock-up or design or some kind of a prototype, within 10 days. And obviously that's a lot to deliver on, but with the way the tools are heading, you can really compress the value prop. And in this episode, you guys are going to learn about the ton of tools that we just talked about and ideate on. Josh was also featured in Lovable's design showcase late last year. So we talked a little bit about that. And I highly encourage you, especially if you view yourself as a creative marketer, you have a background in design, to really lean in for this conversation. I am always following and learning from Josh. We have a recurring call scheduled where we talk ideas, founder mentality, mindset, and just keep each other in it. And you have a lot to learn from Josh today. So that's enough for me. Let's get straight into the episode. But before we do, the highest converting websites, Visual, Swipe File, and Notion, painstaking hours of converting all of the highest converting websites online into a easy to filter and view Notion Swipe File just for you. If you're approaching a redesign, it helps to start from a place that's proven to work. I've done the hard work for you. So that'll be in the first link below, as with all of Josh's information. Without further ado, please welcome to Marketing by Design, Josh Canale.
Yeah, definitely. So I grew up in southern Lancaster County. It's a small part of Pennsylvania, about an hour from Philly, but very, very rural. So Amish everywhere you look, farmland. And it's not an exaggeration that it's middle of nowhere. And so I grew up there until I came out here to Wisconsin. But my world had always felt pretty small. Like I knew that I was into tech and I knew I was into being creative and building things. But when I was in high school, I excelled at a lot of subjects like math and physics. And so for me, that always meant that I had to go into that field if I was good at it. And so I was always on this one track mind towards engineering. I never had a reason to be focused on engineering, but I just thought that was where my path led me. But it wasn't until I started to do some sports like lacrosse. I think that was sophomore year of high school. And I started to pick up a little bit of hobbies here and there and finding the things that I enjoyed doing in my free time. And I started to discover like not as analytical as I thought I was. I do have a creative side to me. I didn't get to explore a lot of that though until I went to college. And so that opened up a whole world for me of like talking to new people and sharing perspectives because, small town, Southern Lancaster County, there's not a lot of new people you meet. I grew up with the same class of like 150, 200 people. So yeah, there was a lot of growth that I had coming out of high school and going into college. But for the most part, I was always sort of chasing independence and wanting to do my own thing. And so freshman year of college, when I started off in engineering, it was not going to class. When I did go to class, I wasn't paying attention. I was getting all around C's, and it reached a point where I was like, I thought I was good at school, but I'm borderline failing right now. Is college meant for me? I didn't know what I actually wanted to do. And so I ended up just, before making a decision to leave, I looked at the list of majors that Penn State offered, and I found human-centered design and development, which is just a long way of saying UX. And never had I heard of UX before, and I also never considered a career in design. I didn't think I really had potential in that area because, I mean, I would like to draw, but it was, like crappy sketches and nothing that you could really put up on a wall anywhere. So then when it was design in a new way of thinking, which I had never really thought about software design and creating interfaces, and I never considered that to be really design. So when I started to practice that and I found passion in it, I realized, okay, this is definitely what I want to do. The coding part, I can leave that to developers because I wasn't really that great at it. But that sort of helped me discover, like, I do have a creative mindset and I want to apply that to my career.
Dude, that's so like a lot of similarities there for me. I grew up in a small rural town too, St. Paris, Ohio. And I think what people don't realize is, I mean, even Columbus is getting pretty big, but what people don't realize is like the level of stimulation that you get from just like a room of like not even that many people or like driving where there's traffic is a lot. It doesn't take much to get that. Like stimulation for me back in, growing up in a small town like that was literally like a town hall or like a busy dinner, like going to dinner in like a suburban city. I think that's an advantage because a lot of people kind of go and seek that out when they go away for school for the first time. The first time I went away for school, it was for golf and it was to Fayetteville, North Carolina. So it was a much bigger city than where I had grown up. I don't know if it's just the same case with you, but the reason I left was because I didn't want to associate with like the small town anymore. Like I felt like I was trying to kind of run away a little bit, which is stupid. I moved back and I'm glad I did. Kind of hearing some of the parts of your story, like, I don't know, it seems like, did you ever have an outlet like when you were younger of manifesting like what might have been that creativity? So I know if I look back and get really intimate on like, okay, what was I actually doing to kind of fuel the career? Like, I was always playing with Legos. I think that was a big thing. I was always journaling, like writing and sketching and getting really into like physical art. I know that wasn't as much of your chapter, but when you talk about how that like analytical side of engineering eventually made you think that's the route you wanted to go and it transitioned to creativity, were there any like weird habits of like young Josh that may have indicated that in the past?
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that pops in my head right away is I loved to build. I wasn't good at it, but I loved to just create things. So I remember finding 3 pieces of scrap wood and just thinking through that I needed a desk. And so I got a couple of nails from my neighbor, and it was just straight up 2 boards and one on top. But I remember the first thing I created, and I was so proud of it.
Yeah.
And then I put it in my room and fell over. I did a lot of Legos too. And so putting all my Legos on top of that was not a good idea. And so then I began to think like, okay, how can I make that better? And so I think this like problem solving mindset started to develop very early on
Uh-huh.
with building. And then I think the other sort of application of that too was little inklings of entrepreneurship as well, where I was really into finding new ways of making a little bit of money, having fun with it too. So I remember, I think it was my senior year of high school. My buddy Caden and I, we had a little like Amish run market that they sold stuff for like a third of the price if it was expired. And so we would go there, get a bunch of the food, snacks, and bring them all to school and sell them for a little bit more. And it wasn't allowed to like sell stuff in school, but we found a way to like bring it to certain classes where teachers were okay with it, and we made some money doing that. And I remember for me that was like the a very simple and maybe silly terms. Like the problem was that these high school students are craving some beef jerky or like a Monster Energy drink, whatever it is,
Yeah.
and I can solve that. And it was just through a little like snack selling business model, but those were little things that added up. Now that I reflect on, I didn't see it at the time, but I was like, okay, that was sort of like the path I was heading was problem solving, but in a strategic, more creative way than the confines of engineering and math and that sort
Yeah,
of.
dude, that's such I think it's almost like the first time you recognize like arbitrage is the word for it. So arbitrage means like you have like this gap between what is needed and what is provided, right? So if you think of like location arbitrage, that's like the wage gap. People take advantage of that to make a business model work. And if I was in the same, but like we used to do the same thing. We didn't do it, but you could go to like Sam's Club and you get these express boxes of candy bars, like variety packs. You get like 100 of them for like a super discounted rate. And if you sell them at $1 a piece, like it's clear profit margin. If I were a kid today, there's so many pieces and places like that
Yeah.
that I could think like, man, well, why wasn't I thinking about that? I was too busy, doing all the weird stuff we were doing. But like right nowadays, I would do that with energy drinks, like
Yeah.
so like easily. Energy drinks, coffee, like stuff like that, where it's so implanted in people's existing routines, either of school or just in their daily lives. That would just be so easy.
Yeah.
And I wish I had lent more into that stuff. Because I think, especially, and this kind of goes into the school system part, which we won't spend a lot of time on, but I think that kind of thinking isn't really encouraged. I think it's getting better now,
Yeah.
especially, small rural area school like I did. It was very much play by the rules, graduate, get, follow the traditional path. And it was encouraged in my household as well. But
Yeah.
dude, kids don't know these days. Like,
Yeah.
and even there was, and another one too that comes to mind that's kind of more along this niche is they started installing VPNs on our like Chromebooks. So we just started getting those before we graduated. And if I think like if I could develop like a lightweight VPN or just game that people could play on their Chromebooks that would get around the VPN or made it easier or something along that solution, like that would have been huge. Anyway, the past is always a lot clearer than, looking back at it. It makes a lot more sense. But anyway, I want to go more into kind of your design career and what you're doing now, so accelerate the timeline a little bit. But did you ever have a moment where, I think we talked about it a little bit off camera in our first chat, but I always think about these like light bulb moments. I know it sounds a little bit random and obscure, but like hang with me because I'm going somewhere with this. I think it is the first time you have a positive experience with something like AI where you feel like it's really transformational. Think, okay, this is exactly where I was. This is how it's making a difference in exactly what I do. And it's almost like nothing is going to be the same kind of moving forwards. I think we all have a story like that. And when I see like what you do and how you've implemented AI into what you have done for your past job roles, I feel like there might have been a moment where you started leaning into it a lot and it's kind of led you down this trajectory to where you are now. So do you have any like one moment you could kind of point to where it's like, okay, this is going to be something that changes what I do for the future and really doubling down on it?
Yeah, I definitely have a moment like that, and I'll give a little bit of context so it's a little clearer. So
Okay.
when I graduated college, I got a job at Epic. I know I told you, but it's a leading EHR platform in America, so just healthcare software. And I got put on the data analytics team. And I remember the first project that I did for Epic was actually very heavily focused on AI, but not generative
Okay.
AI. It was more of predictive analytics. So this was in the very like first month, I think. We were doing training and I saw some of the stuff Epic was doing around machine learning and, for example, like sepsis scores and predicting some of the things around. And so we had model explainers that a user could click on, and I thought it was just very hard to understand, like putting myself in the
Okay.
shoes of a clinician. And
Yeah.
so it really excited me in that moment to think through how I could make that easier to use and how I could build trust in the models that Epic is developing. And so that's just a reflection point of like one of the very first things I did was around AI. And then being in the data analytics world, I was constantly working with the machine learning teams and adjacent areas. And so when ChatGPT came out, Epic was on a huge race to develop as many things as they could that use generative AI. And so as Epic has over 80 applications, so as these like 3,000-ish developers are all building in silos, these really cool features, me and a team of other designers noticed that the design piece was sort of missing. And so this got my gears turning a little more around, okay, this is really, really evolving very quickly. And design has a very important piece in the process, but it was sort of being forgotten about at an enterprise scale. And so we worked together me and another designer created a design system around all generative AI across Epic. And so once we got that done, it was a couple months after they started development. I took over the AI design system and became like the AI design expert for teams. And so that was a moment for me of, okay, I didn't necessarily choose this path. It sort of just got put on my lap because of how fast things were moving. But I enjoy this a lot. Like those 3-4 months flew by when we were doing the design work, which always to me is a good sign that I'm enjoying what I do.
Mm-hmm.
And then I remember shortly after that, this was the pivotal moment. I was reading an article by Jacob Nielsen. He's one of the pioneers of UX and usability. He put out an article saying that essentially generative AI is changing the design industry just how the dot-com boom, and he made this claim that he predicted only 3,000 designers were getting experience with designing for AI at that moment, which I think was 2023, and that he predicted in 2 years companies are going to be on this huge race to try and hire designers who have at least 2 years designing for AI. And so I'm reading that and I'm thinking,
Huh.
I'm one of these people that he's talking about right now,
Uh-huh.
getting experience in a very complex space, being healthcare, across a bunch of different design patterns, like agentic AI and in the background, autonomous AI. And so then I started to think about how could I make a leap and create a business around this. So I did wait about a year and a half, 2 years from that moment to get a bunch of experience designing for AI. And then this past March is when I felt fully confident, not fully ready, but I felt very confident that I could start working with billion different companies that are using AI and creating AI. So that article I remember reading was that pivotal moment for me.
Is that the one we talked about last time? Is that the one you
What's
shared
that?
with
You
me
cut out
last
there.
time? Is that the same one you shared with
Yeah.
me in our last chat? Okay. Yeah. First of all, you'll never be fully ready to make the transition. That's just the last tangent from what you just said. But I think I want to give you a kudos because I feel like, and I know this for a fact, a lot of people see something that maybe threatens their identity or when people see something that threatens their identity or their vision of who they are, like I'm a designer, like I'm a creative, like this is my workflow, this is what I do, you shut it down because anything that threatens this perception of what I do or creates any sort of change is uncomfortable to lean into. So the first thing I want to say, and I noticed this when we first connected, was I see you leading into that, and I think that's something that you should continue to do. So just like as a third person, like feedback on Josh as person, continue to do that because that's going to be an asset for you, not just in entrepreneurship, but as a designer as well. When you talk about that article in specific and sort of the transition from what you learned at Epic to doing it under your own business, becoming a founder, what are the similarities between what you were doing then and what you are doing now? And what did you learn in the full-time job employment realm, building that design system that then informed what you are doing now on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. One of the biggest differences is, so now I work with AI startups to design their AI experiences, is of course team size. Like Epic is such a massive company. And so designing for an enterprise system with that level of complexity and trying to create consistency is a lot harder to do at that scale compared to a startup that's a smaller team or in its earlier stage. So that's a big difference. But interestingly, within the silos of like each feature that an app team is developing at Epic, it sort of works like a startup to begin with. And especially with AI, you get very
Huh.
scrappy. Everything is experimental. And so even though I was working at an enterprise level, it felt like I was working within just dozens of many little startups that were
Huh.
cross-pollinating and getting feedback from each other. And so when I came out here, started doing my own thing with startups, I felt like it was very similar. I think startups tend to work a little bit more isolated because they're, on their own path, and a lot of the different business goals are different. But I do feel
Well, I
like,
think a lot of designers are isolated to begin with in more
yeah,
ways than one, but continue. Yeah.
no, I agree. I think it's hard to really put yourself deep into a different product when you're the one of the goals of being a designer is to get really deep into the problem space. So
Yeah.
it's a challenge to try and balance all of that. And so with at the speed that AI is moving, that was a huge similarity that I saw, is that there's just within an enterprise dozens of startups, and then in this case outside of an
Hmm.
enterprise there's dozens of startups. I mean,
Hmm.
that's point thousands of startups. So that
Yeah.
was one thing that I noticed coming out.
Yeah. I think I like how you can take like even working from an enterprise where it's big, you're kind of insight around treating each one like a startup in and of itself. Um, is a big insight. And I don't think a lot of people think about that unless they have time sort of inside the organization. I think from the outside, things always look a lot more put together and defensible than they actually are. And when you get inside, you're like, what the hell is going on in here? Like this is a shit show.
Yeah.
Not saying that that's the case, but I have seen and imagined that to be the case with a lot of larger organizations where there's not as much oversight, and things get diluted across different departments. I want to paint, and as you can see, we're slowly like narrowing the funnel in terms of like, at least in my mind, I don't know, I'm not the best host, but
No,
I was
you're
sort
good.
of slowly kind of narrowing the funnel and like, okay, Josh, unique value proposition. So I want you to paint me a hypothetical. Say I am a designer. I want to start my own business. I want to build, I think, obviously, remove like the context of like best business practices. So, like marketing, like, okay, have an offer, have an audience. So, those things might play a role into this little hypothetical as well, but kind of remove that context and just focus more on the tactical like trades. So, I'm a designer, I'm a creative. I want to have my own offering for an audience. And I have experience in a past product design or graphic design, traditional design realm. I brand myself as a designer and I want to be an independent who is providing that service to other companies, startups, marketing teams, etc. What is the difference between someone who might be starting their own design business, say like 5 years ago, pre AI, versus now? What are some of the things that they need to be learning, doing? How does their day to day look? I imagine, and this is sort of could be a springboard into your response, but I imagine it's a lot less time doing tactical work and a lot more time on things like taste development. So leaning on their past experience to know how end result of what they do matches client expectations or dream state rather than like actual fulfillment. Again, that's like me just shooting off the wall. So talk to me about like, this is like the longest winded question ever, but talk to me about like what past designers look like versus what the future designers will look like basically, and what the contrast is, what they should be focusing on, etc.
Okay. So what you just mentioned, I think falls into one bucket that I'm thinking of, which is skill set. And then the other way that I'm thinking about and bucketing things is process. So speaking to skill set first, I think what you mentioned is spot on. Like the one thing that's not going to change is intuition, taste development. It might just happen on a faster scale, but that is super critical. I've always described that as vision, just being able to have an idea and know where it's headed. It doesn't need to have, you don't need to have the final position in mind, but having an intuition of where it should be going. That's something that you just get through experience, whether it's AI driven or not. Another thing that is, I think, a little more different in terms of skill set, I think in the past, and of course, like I was still in school. I don't even think I knew what UX was 5 years ago, but if I were to put myself in those shoes, it's a lot more execution oriented. Can we take the idea and make a design around it? And what's the design process? Let's execute the research, wireframes, the prototyping, and doing the actual production steps. And now, of course, we're seeing that AI can touch so many of those points, and I think it's only going to get more streamlined. And so it becomes a lot more about strategy, like we touched on, vision, creativity, and being able to think outside the box. That one's really, really important because I think over the past couple of years, like designers have always had to try and stand out with their work. We have templates and we have the dribble effect. Everything kind of takes the same form. AI is making it that much more saturated. And so you ask Lovable or Google Stitch, whatever tool you use to create a design, and it's going to look like the 1,000 other designs that are generated before, because that's how it works. So I think the really critical skill there is, can you take that as a starting point and create something that is unique, that pushes the limits of your vision, that exceeds the business goals? Because people don't really want average anymore, and it's important to stand out.
Yeah, that's really good.
The piece about strategy is really being able to take more of a high level perspective of the design process and manage it a little more instead of being on the ground doing the actual tests. And so there's still going to be a ton of oversight and augmentation that the designer needs to step in, but I think it becomes a lot more systems level thinking. Can you see the entire process and product development cycle as a whole? How does that product fit into the entire ecosystem it belongs in? Those are some skills that I think are a little more important nowadays than they might have been 5 years ago. So that's
I think, that was really good. I think even part of it is just like, it's almost like you accelerate. I'm almost picturing like a design student coming out of school, right? Like you almost accelerate directly to more of like a creative director kind of job, like almost right off the bat. I think that's such a disconnect. I think a lot of people aren't ready for that almost. Like they kind of skip the necessary steps of doing what it takes to know what good looks like. I know like there's this analogy that like coaches don't play, right? But you have to know how the game is played to be able to know what good looks like. I think there's part of it of you can't improve a process without having gone through the outdated way beforehand almost. So if you don't know how to get from, say, creative brief to like scalable brand system the old fashioned way, I think it's going to be a lot harder to engineer that even using really efficient tools because there's a prompting process, there's alignment. I think the people that can solve the problem of piecing that together in like the most efficient way is what it's going to look like. So I want to get really granular with you in terms of the specific actions. Like, okay, picture a designer that maybe spends a lot of time in software. Say I am a product designer. I spend a mix of, say I'm a solo web slash UX designer, and I work on a fractional basis with startups and small companies, marketing teams. Maybe in a typical week, say 4 hours of my day is spent in Figma creating mock-ups, concepts. Maybe it's for a landing page or a new product offering, just visuals around it. Probably they're removed from the brand ideation phase, but they're in the brand messaging phase. They're in the marketing campaign. Say I spend 4 hours a day in Figma. Say I spend 2 hours a day in meetings, and I spend maybe 1 to 2 hours a day on admin ideation for like future launches. Where do you think in 2 to 3 years, do you think that job title will exist? How will that change? So will product designers be named something different? And what will that specific day actions output? What will the output of their day look like? As opposed to maybe what it looks like now, like I mentioned in software, in meetings, how that time allocation is what I would say is traditionally spent. How is that going to change?
Yeah. So I think product designer is still going to be a title because there's still going to be a product. The word designer might just be a little more loose. As we talked about, I think a lot more of the strategy will fall into the designer's plate. And I also think on the other side, a lot more of implementation will fall into the designer's plate. So, currently to hand off a design to a developer is a pretty straightforward process, and there's not a lot of code or working prototypes that you actually develop. That's been on the developer side. And I think we're moving towards being able to get something that's 80% of the way there. And so the developer then becomes a lot more specialized in back-end development and security, those types of highly specialized tasks. And so I think that designers are moving towards a broader scope of what it means to be a designer. As far as the day-to-day, I think the design process is changing a lot. And I think we're going to be seeing like a new way of thinking about what a process looks like. And so, for example, for me, prototyping, at least in my mental model, has always been one of the last things you do throughout the entire iterative cycle of design. Now, I feel like prototyping is becoming a stage of ideation. And so I'll give a little more context too. I have a condition called aphantasia. So I have no ability to visualize imagery. I don't have a mind's eye. And so for me, it's always been a process of if I have an idea or a concept, it's all conceptual, and I have to then trial and error, get into Figma, start visualizing it that way. And ideation has been a lot of just sketching and low fidelity design. But now my ideation is becoming more, let me spend a lot of time doing a lot of deep research, creating a very solid foundation for what the prompt should be, and then creating a couple different directions in Lovable or something that I can click around with, which is traditionally a prototyping step. And so I don't think prototyping is disappearing as like a later step in the design process, but it's being more intertwined throughout the process, I think. The other piece that is interesting to me and how we're moving is the process is becoming a lot more condensed and a lot more iterative. And so when it took, a couple of weeks maybe to do desk research and talk with users and analyze those findings, come up with a problem, I think that can all be consolidated and done in a very short amount of time. So you can get a very solid foundation very quickly now with AI at your hand. And then being able to move into just experimentation. So design and the design process to me is just a lot like the scientific method. And you have a hypothesis and you want to test it. And you can test on the fly real time quicker than ever. I see that becoming more and more efficient. And so I've already seen tools. I played around with one last week where you can upload your Figma link, just a prototype, to a site, and it creates AI users that you can define personas for and their user goals, give the proper business context, and then the AI users will run through the prototype and point out a bunch of usability errors or things that they might get stuck on. And so the traditional way of user testing is, you find real users and you do the sit down recaps and interviews.
like usability hub, it's always expensive. Like that's probably a really big problem to solve, I'd imagine.
Yep. Expensive, and it's time intensive. It takes
Mhm.
a couple of weeks sometimes to get to a point where you're like, okay, we know what to iterate on now. But now, if you can streamline all of that and you can create a solid foundation, create multiple experiments that are in the form of a prototype, test that real time with AI users, and then get get measurable impact. You can get metrics on which ones, like quantitatively, are the most successful. You can run a whole series of experiments, and once you get a quote unquote MVP, that's when you can dive into, okay, we're going to sit down and talk to the users that are actually going to be using this. And I think
Mm.
that entire process is just collapsed now, and it's
Yeah,
more
that's.
collapsed.
But I don't think you could ever imagine doing any type of testing before development or before launch. Like that never was ever in the conversation. So that's a really good tangent. That's definitely something I'm interested in.
Yeah.
To not just the speed and so much of what you just said too. So the not just the speed to launch, but also the steps in the process and knowing how designers are going to streamline that for in their own. So for my biggest takeaway there is kind of, you mentioned your condition is like the skill, I think, is becoming more better to interact with getting to alignment faster. So like you can call it prompting, you can call it prompting, I guess. But I think the another skill that's crucial and what I'm learning is that there's kind of like all these disjointed tools that you're kind of one, and I think this is part of where we are in the AI development process is like a lot of them are disjointed, which is how every new technology kind of starts. There's no until softwares get really siloed and very niche application value added. So you start to have really specific use cases from start to finish for different industries, different product teams, different workflows that are very specific. I think a lot of skill lies in being able to have like a lean and non-overwhelming stack that can get you to end result quickest and knowing how to interweave them with one another. Because what I'm seeing too is that we go and experiment with like wire, because we do web design and that process has changed completely.
Mhm.
So a lot of it is knowing part, especially if you're a startup, you're running your own business. Like I think there's a big skill in knowing like what tool stack is going to benefit your business and not cause you more in terms of, okay, I have a design system. I need to solve this. I need to make it scalable. If I'm a startup founder, I need to make that happen. You can waste a lot of time wondering what tools to use, wondering how do I save my own time, my own energy, and allocate it towards the needle moving tasks rather than just having it done and wasting a lot of time and energy. So what are if you could give like a this is great. So if you give like a short prompting guide. So how are you interacting with tools in order to get the result that you want? It's keeping it super high level, keeping it tool agnostic for now before we get into sharing some of, the fun shiny ones
Mhm.
that we're playing with. But on a high level, say I'm just beginner, say my knowledge level with AI is, or I'm pretty good at getting with some of the basic tools, GPT, Claude, Perplexity, and I'm just starting to branch out into some of these more niche specific design tools. When it comes to design specifically, are there any prompt suggestions that you can make for getting better outputs that are somewhat universal across all the ones that you've tried?
Yeah. So one thing that I think is important to start with is to treat your task like a design sprint. And the way that one prompt works for a certain use case is not going to be just as valuable as another use case. So there's a couple of things that I use to really nail down my prompts depending on the quote unquote sprint that I'm in. One is I have a GPT. It's called Craft Prompter. Craft is an acronym. I forget what it stands for, but it's some sort of a principle for, it's like context, role, action, and a couple other things. And it's a good
Uh,
framework for structuring your prompts so that AI has context is so important when you're trying to
uh,
give the necessary knowledge that it needs to perform what you're trying to do.
uh,
So I have a GPT that I can just say like, I'm looking to ideate on this user problem and ways that we can solve it. And then it will ask me a couple questions to dive a little deeper. And then it'll give me a fully fleshed out prompt that is optimal for a certain tool. Most
So
of the
that's
time,
kind of like your 0 to 1, no matter what tool you're using. starting somewhere like a prompt formatter.
Yep,
Okay.
exactly. And some tools are starting to embed that within their tools. For
Okay.
example, UX Pilot is a good design generator tool, and they have in the text box where you're writing the prompt, you can enhance the prompt. So we're starting
Yeah.
to become more of a thing now, embedded. But being able to have some sort of process for here's my goal, help me create a solid foundation for that. Because if you're using a vibe coding platform and you don't have a solid first prompt, it's you're not going to get very far. So you really do need
Yeah.
to spend time making it very, very well structured.
Yeah, it's like I mean, it's true with any AI of like when you first start adding context, it's like a plane taking off, like the analogy when like a plane taking off from like California to New York, if it's like 1 degree off, it's like gonna slowly get further and further away from the desired end result.
Yep.
I think in design that's compounding because there's so much subjectivity in it. It's like, okay, what I'm seeing here isn't quite aligned. I need to take a step back and, generate something that's a bit more on brief because I can see that happening, very fast. And I think also something that we haven't pointed out is that I think design AI is anything visual more so in terms of artificial intelligence with design is inherently, I'd appreciate your feedback on this because this might be way off base, but I feel like it's more costly from a user like a development standpoint. So I feel like it's more energy costing my end to like generate and requiring tokens and money to be able to generate outputs that are visually based. Because I think of something like even the image generation in ChatGPT is the most expensive part of its bandwidth. Like it's a very energy taxing process for it to do. So that not only emphasizes how important it is to be aligned prompt wise from the beginning, so you're not wasting credits, you're not wasting money on these design tools, but you're actually eventually reaching an end result that is somewhat aligned. Is that somewhat on base in terms of the energy cost of design tools? Do they tend to be more expensive?
For sure. I mean, I know vibe coding is probably within my stack the most expensive. I've wasted dozens of tokens sometimes just trying to reprompt it, and then I go back and start over, reprompt, and then it's not getting anywhere.
Yeah,
And
it's like
so
whack-a-mole.
yeah, for real. And sometimes it really just takes, okay, let me start at the drawing board again. What is my problem? Sometimes it's like, okay, I didn't really clearly define who the user was. I didn't specify B2B or B2C or call out their primary goals and their top three and their steps that they're taking in their workflow.
Pause. Sorry, I know I told you this last time, but when I interrupt because I'm interested, but how good do you see an AI as a whole, no matter what tool? This is like all agnostic right now. How well do you see it being able to, in its current state, be able to say, this is audience, like abstract research with no visual language attached, no color codes, no design brief, nothing visual related, and it generating a visual output that then matches that. How well do you see that? How good do you think that is currently? And do you think that's something that's going to improve in the future?
And you're saying like connecting the dots essentially between,
Yeah, from like audience, like say I have a 30-year-old male, like design something that would appeal to, say, like even when you say B2B versus B2C, that inherently creates a stake in the ground as to what might be more visually appealing from a brand standpoint, company standpoint. You can think, okay, B2C is a lot more, okay, maybe vibrant colors, it's food, beverage, things like that, where we're appealing to a more general consumer. Therefore, 3 steps down the line in thinking process, we're thinking, okay, that's how we create a design for that. How well do you see it being able to take those steps from something that's abstract, like audience research, to then generating like a visual component? Because I think that's inherently fascinating, like how it can do that.
I think the classic designer response is it depends.
Yeah.
I think that applies here. So like we mentioned earlier, the way that AI is trained is on, mediocrity, essentially, like the middle of the bell curve. And so if you're prompting for the middle of the bell curve, it's going to do a better job at giving you connecting the dots and giving you something that you're probably looking for. So if it's 30-year-old male or a teenager, it might be able to pick across its database and its knowledge and figure out, okay, this is what the trends suggest. But the more specific you get in your prompt, or if you're really innovating in a product that doesn't have a lot of competitors or is in a new market, it's going to be really hard for AI to connect the dots right now. And I
Mhm.
think I see that being true for the next couple of years.
Huh.
So sometimes when I've tested, I'll give Lovable as an example. I tested it once to say, make an app that's like a UFO marketplace for aliens. And I gave a little more context, but I'm really into aliens, so I was like, okay, let's see how it would do with that. It knocked it out of the park. It did really, really well. And I think the
Huh.
reason why is because one, it's so like fictional and you can make up a bunch of stuff and it would be considered connecting the dots, like naming the
Uh-huh.
alien Zorb Glorb, for example, is what it did. And it's like, that makes sense. Like, okay.
Uh-huh.
But then if you steer away from something that is as generic as that and you start to get really granular, it doesn't perform as well.
I think part of that too is the like fiction versus nonfiction context. And you'll hear people say, I don't know whether or not it's true, but fiction is always easier to write than nonfiction because you aren't following reality.
Right.
And what I mean by that is like I can say, okay, if I generate like a fictitious prompt or anything, then I'm not comparing it to objective like past failure. Whereas in fiction, it's a lot easier to say right or wrong. Like there's a lot less gray area in terms of objective versus subjective. That's
Yeah,
what I think I'm trying to get at. But
I agree.
that's really cool, actually. That's something that I'm always thinking about is okay, how do we because that's what the role of design is taking the steps from abstract to visuals, like those steps from audience research, what the facts are, and then creating the creative behind it that is subjective, and you slowly move down that scale of that process and what role does like AI is playing in each of those and where it currently sits in there. I want to get like super tactical or granular now with like specific tools that you're playing and messing around with. I made a video last week talking about a lot of the ones that I use in mine as a front end web designer, mostly doing marketing websites, landing pages, sales pages, etc., like that. So purely front end, a lot of brand work involved, obviously a lot of audience research is what falls into my process personally. But when you talk about, say, I am a startup founder and I go to Josh's website and I think, okay, I need to make my startup AI design enabled. Like I need to have that. That's a very high priority item for me in the beginning. What specific tools should I have my eye on? And how could I start to, like we talked about in the beginning, make sure I'm starting from a good position as a startup founder and having that my priorities right in the beginning?
Yeah. The first thing that I think about is to beware of the hype. There is, as you know, like you scroll on LinkedIn for 30 seconds, you're going to see 8 new tools you've never heard of. And it's overwhelming. And I think a
Hmm.
lot of designers have the impression that they're very, very behind because they keep on seeing these new tools pop up. But really, it's just competitors of leading tools. And if you really dig in, they're all in some way or another trying to do the same thing. And so I think my initial advice is when you're trying to figure out your stack, just try and stick with the big players in the game to start with. I think those are the ones that are setting the precedent. They're great to learn from and practice the skills. And then you can learn what are your preferences as a tool and get a little more granular. But for me personally, when I think about my design process, it always starts with research and creating that solid foundation. And for me, it's either ChatGPT or Perplexity. ChatGPT is all around, like, aside from research, just my general purpose tool, and I use it for a lot of things. But for bouncing ideas, I have some GPTs that are focused on strategizing, nailing down user goals, researching problem spaces. Its deep research feature is really, really powerful, I think. But then you compare that deep research feature to Perplexity, which is a little more specialized in deep research. And I've been using that more. And I think that Perplexity is a little bit better in terms of that. And so those are the two that I mainly use. I know Claude is also a really popular one. I haven't dived too much into that other than for writing. So
Uh-huh.
that's a little bit later in the design process. But for copywriting and stuff, I'll use Claude.
Uh-huh.
So that's my research and like foundation laying stack. And then there's some tools for starting lower fidelity and then getting into higher fidelity. So I
Uh-huh.
have this problem where I am very quick to jump into high fidelity. I know that's not best practice most of the time, but
All designers.
it's hard. So I've been trying to explore how I can pull myself back, start with, paralleling to the traditional design process, creating sketches or wireframes. And so Reloom is a great one. You can
Uh-huh.
create sitemaps, you can create wireframes, and then style guides using that. And it's fully customizable. And it's, like I said, it's a very great way for me to visualize the direction we can head. and test out different
Mhm.
concepts. It also has a cool feature where you can package up each of the directions that you put together once you like put some polish on them and present them. And there's a print flow that you can loop in stakeholders and get feedback. I think that's really
Mhm.
nice. There's some other ones that I think do all right with wireframing, but most of the time I do jump into high fidelity, so I'll speak more to that. Google Stitch is one that I use here and there. It's not great. It used to be Galileo, if you've heard of that.
Huh.
Google acquired that. It's all right here and there. Like I said, with the alien thing, it knocked it out of the park. Other times it's
Mhm.
complete garbage. So I've been moving away from that. They do have some nice features where you can copy mockups to Figma with auto layout applied
Huh.
and everything, and so you can edit from there. And that's nice for more scrappy visualization work. But for me, most of the time I hop into Lovable. And so if
Mhm.
I have the solid foundation, I have a solid idea of what the direction's going to be, I'll start prototyping it as a way of designing and ideating and like bundling all that up into one step. And so when I'm doing that, I'll give an example. Right now, as like a little passion project, I'm developing a vibe coding, I guess I should say, an app for people with diabetes to take pictures of their food and get carb estimates that they can use to dose out their insulin. My girlfriend has
Uh-huh.
type 1 diabetes, and so she gave me the idea. She's right next to me at all times, and I'm able to real time build this thing, test out interactions and flows. And then I hop on, she's across the country right now. So I'll hop on a call with her and get her feedback. And she's like, yeah, I don't think I would use that one thing. That's not important to me, but I really like
Huh.
this flow. And so then
Mhm.
it's like, okay, that whole process of creating ideas, creating designs, creating a prototype, and testing it, I just did in like an hour
Mhm.
for like a specific feature, not the entire product. And
Mhm.
so that's my main where I put most of my marbles in is vibe coding as a way of accomplishing multiple things.
If you had to say, have you tried any other like high fidelity vibe coding tools and your process of kind of landing on Lovable? Or because I've seen Lovable to be kind of the most effective, not just in terms of the prompting and iteration, so there's less kind of that whack-a-mole going on, but also just the meeting you where you're at. So it can take already developed code, it can take prompts really well. You said you start from a better place in the beginning, obviously. And if we keep coming back to this, but there's so much emphasis and weight of the importance of just the alignment from the beginning.
Yep.
So I think traditionally as a designer, like we talked about skipping to high fidelity, there's a big cost there when you're incorrect. I think that's being multiplied and compounded when a lot of these tools are being automated because they don't have the taste of saying, okay, I can skip past, the foundational steps of knowing the user, knowing the audience, doing the research, having the low fidelity to then be able to skip the pieces of the middle. So I think it's front weighting our process in the beginning and doing a lot of the manual alignment work. But back to the tactical. So when you talk about high fidelity vibe coding tools, how have you landed on Lovable as your choice? And have you experimented with any others? And third part question, which you're not supposed to do in podcast interviews, is ask multiple part questions. Do you see different high fidelity vibe coding tools being different or being more valuable to different types of designers based on what they want the output to be?
I don't think I have an answer for that one.
Uh,
Mainly because I've spent 90% of my time in Lovable for vibe coding. I've tested out
mhm,
Bolt. I've tested out B0 by Vercel. They're good. Like there's nothing that pushed me away from them, but I just felt most comfortable with Lovable. I also felt like it was leading the way. I think it's now like the fastest growing startup in
mhm.
history or something like that.
Yeah, just got funded for like billions.
Yeah,
So,
that to me is a sign that, there's going to be a lot of improvements. It's going to be
mhm,
integrating with a lot more tools. And so if there's any way to like zoom out, see where the tools are as competitors and where they might be heading, I see Lovable being one that can go really far. So I'm trying to get really comfortable with that. I will
mhm,
say it's not great at manual editing. They
mhm.
made an update recently to do, they called it like more streamlined manual editing. And I don't think it's more streamlined. I think it's a lot worse and it causes issues. But
Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. How I want to land the plane talking about learning. So I'm a designer. I am a marketer. I have my eyes on maybe being an independent service provider of my own, and I want to be as AI enabled as possible in order to make that happen. What are the things I should be filling my brain with other than following Josh on LinkedIn? Where else should I go to keep, at the forefront of this, making sure that I'm not just more valuable to my clients, but I'm prepared and that I'm staying ahead, and also just for my own benefit in terms of engaging my own curiosity, creating a better product? How do I stay on the leading edge of all this?
Yeah. So I'd say it really does come down to following and staying up to date, not to promote myself, but there's people that know way more than me. And for example, following Lovable on LinkedIn and just seeing what they're investing their time and energy into can give you a pretty good feel of where the industry's heading. Following people in the space that you sort of admire their workflows, and maybe if they have a business model that's successful and they run an AI driven design agency, what were the steps that they took to get there? And I think it's so valuable just to reach out and ask questions, be
Mhm.
curious. People are 9 times out of 10 super willing to share their expertise and their process of getting there. So a huge help to me in my journey so far has been making a LinkedIn post, asking a question, someone responds, they have an idea, and we hop on a call together for 15 minutes and we jam it out, figure out what are we learning, what direction are we heading. And that process of cross pollination really can save you from heading towards the hype that's not all that. So
Yeah.
making sure you're a part of a community and following the right people that have a good pulse on where things are heading, I think that is really important. The other thing that comes to mind that has helped me a lot is, have you ever read Lean Startup by Eric Ries?
Eric Rise, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I love that book. I think 70%
Yeah.
of the way through. One of the core principles for people that haven't read it is it's build, measure, learn, I think is the process.
Mhm.
And I think you can apply that to so many areas of your life, particularly business. So if you're a designer, either earlier in your career or you have a full-time job, you're looking to make a jump, I think you should always start with experimentation. I have an idea, if it's a product, if it's a service business, whatever it is, defining your ICP, who are the people I'm going to be targeting, and then doing little experiments to test out the potential there. And so you can do that in a business context and saying like, okay, I reached out to 30 founders, if that's your target market. I pitched them my sort of value proposition and I got this type of response. That means I should probably tweak and head in this course. That's one of the process I'm doing right now because I'm finding that the way that I'm positioning myself needs to be even more AI driven. And so through a process of experimentation, measuring the right things and learning throughout the process, that's pushing me in the right direction. I don't have a
Yeah.
final
I think
solution.
yeah, no, that's spot on. I think this whole audience research piece that we kind of talked about is so much harder to apply to our own businesses. And I think knowing how we can honestly just like objectively saying, how do we do this for AI? It makes it easier to do this for ourselves because it's so hard to remove ourselves from our just the bullshit that goes into our minds about our own business. And I think just the practice of saying, okay, this is the context, this is my target audience. And even, I mean, I'm use AI a ton for learning. Like that's a big part of what I use it for. I use Notebook LM a ton to say like, this is my objective, what I want to learn. You know my goals. What's the 301 university level education I can take to get there? Lay that out for me. And I think when we're applying that to our own business, just being as objective as possible, it makes it a lot more approachable to take those actions when you can kind of remove yourself from the emotions of it.
Definitely.
But dude, man, this has been awesome. This hour has absolutely flown by.
Yeah.
It's been a lean forward conversation for me for sure. Like I said, I'm always trying to learn about this stuff, and a lot of people in the audience are as well. So where can people get in touch with you, learn everything your business that you're cooking up, and maybe continue the conversation if they want to.
Yeah, definitely. So I'd say the main channel is LinkedIn, Josh Canale, Canale. You'll find me posting on there a lot about AI, not only designing for AI, but how we're using AI for design. And then I also have a newsletter for that, comes out bi-weekly, and it digests a lot of the new stuff that you should know that cuts through the hype for AI design. I'd say those are my main two things. I also want to say like I mentioned before, I'm very curious, always open to learning and talking with people. And so if you have an idea for a new way of designing with AI, or if you want to talk business and how to start a business in this fast evolving world, I'm open to talk about that too, because I'm constantly learning and growing as a designer and entrepreneur. So I'm always open to that.